I knew about the chocolatine thing before I ever went to Toulouse. The pastry itself is simple enough. It's that flaky rectangle with the 2 bars of chocolate running through the middle. Basically a croissant folded around chocolate. In Paris, you ask for a pain au chocolat. Down in the southwest, in places like Toulouse, that exact same pastry, same thing, same everything, is a chocolatine. I knew that going in. I'd read about it. And I knew it's the kind of thing people in France have very strong feelings about. So I arrived feeling reasonably prepared. But turns out, knowing a thing at home is very different from standing there in an actual boulangerie in Toulouse and seeing chocolatine written out on the little sign in the display case. And I ordered one myself, out loud. Chocolatine. And yeah, that gave me a small thrill. And then, while I was looking at the rest of the case, I noticed that they had a snail pastry. I don't remember what it's called exactly, but it was something like pain escargot. And it looked a tiny little bit green. Escargot. I've had the escargot dish quite a few times in French restaurants, and I like it when it's buttery, garlicky. Eat it with some really good baguette. Soak up the garlicky butter and olive oil with the bread. Yum. So I thought, oh, that's really interesting and unique. A uniquely flavored snail bread at this Toulouse bakery. I had to get it. So I got a chocolatine and a pain escargot. Very pleased with myself. And I happily walked out and went and found a nice spot down by the river to dig into my pastries. I pulled the escargot pastry out of its paper bag with excitement and anticipation, and I bit into it. And it was sweet. As soon as I chewed it, I had this realization that exploded in my head, and then I laughed out loud at myself, like actually laughing out loud, in real life, sitting on a riverbank on my own. My thought process went roughly in this order. Wait, it's sweet. It tastes like a pain au raisin. There's no snail. Wait, it tastes exactly like a pain au raisin? What's going on? Wait a minute. Is this a whole misunderstanding? Oh, wait, the shape. The shape of a pain au raisin. Could that be it? Is that it? Yes. Oh my gosh. Oh, silly me. I totally misunderstood the pain escargot. So, it's a snail because of the shape. It's a spiral. It's coiled. It's wound up around itself like a little shell. And that is how the pastry got its name. The pain escargot turns out to have 0 snail in it. I sort of, maybe a little embarrassingly, dreamed up that idea. Oh, and one more thing about that snail pastry, which I only found out much later. Just like the famous pain au chocolat versus chocolatine, this pastry has its own argument, and its own drama, too. Most of France just calls it a pain au raisin. That's the simple, direct name, the one that tells you what's inside it. Raisin bread. But around Lyon, it's a pain russe, a Russian bread, and nobody seems very sure why. And over in Alsace, up on the German border, it's a Schneck, which is the Alsatian version of the German word for a snail. So Alsace looked at that same spiral and landed on snail as well. They just said it in German. Pretty interesting. And the French press has already started calling the raisin snail the next chocolatine, the next pastry the whole country is going to argue about. That escargot, by the way, gets built. It's laminated dough, which is dough with butter folded into it over and over so that it bakes in layers. The same family as a croissant. And it's filled with pastry cream and raisins wound up into a spiral. And then the whole coil gets set down inside a little metal ring so it holds its shape in the oven instead of relaxing outward into a puddle. Anyway, once I'd worked out the snail, I got curious about the rest of the names. There is the religieuse, which just means a nun. It's two choux pastries stacked up, and choux are those light hollow puffs, the same thing an éclair is made of. A bigger one underneath, a smaller one on top, with a collar of cream piped around where they meet, and a little cap of cream over the top. Big one is the body, small one is the head, and the collar is a collar. It got the name because people looked at it and saw a nun in her habit, the long dark robe and the pale collar at the throat. And I'm telling you, once somebody says nun, that is the only thing you can see. And then there's the chausson aux pommes. We'd call it an apple turnover. In French, it's a chausson, which is the soft slipper you wear around the house. And the pastry is dough folded over into a fat little pocket. And somebody took one look at that and saw a slipper. There's a town out in the Sarthe, west of Paris, called Saint-Calais, that takes the slipper extremely seriously. The story they tell there is that back in the 1600s, an epidemic came through, and the lady of the manor fed the survivors with one big apple pastry, and the town has marked it every year since. There's a brotherhood for it now. An actual brotherhood of the apple turnover, with a grand master, a man named Patrick Gautier, and they make people knights of it, and they have formally registered the recipe so that nobody can quietly change it on them. Their version isn't the individual one in your bakery display case either. It's one enormous chausson, made to be shared out between several people, because the sharing is meant to matter as much as the eating. And they've held that festival every year since the 1600s. The one in 2019 was the 389th. So a snail and a nun and a slipper, and not one of those names is telling you what's inside. They're telling you what the thing looks like from across the counter. Michel Roquita runs a bakery called Credo in Toulouse, which is chocolatine country, and he decided to settle the whole thing with logic. He starts from the dough they make baguette tradition with. That's the proper, old-fashioned baguette, just flour and water and salt and yeast, nothing else in it. And it's sitting in an enormous mechanical arm that keeps turning it and turning it. One of his bakers, Kenji, pulls a lump of it out and works in cocoa powder and sugar and chocolate chips until the whole blob goes brown. It proofs, which is the slow rise, and then it gets shaped into balls, and then into little loaves, and then it goes into the oven. And what comes out are these dark, pot-bellied miniature baguettes. And his case is hard to beat, and he makes it himself, standing right there. It's bread, he says, and it's got chocolate in it, and it's made with bread dough, which is the one thing a pain au chocolat ought to be, going by the words. And the pain au chocolat you actually buy is not bread at all. So call this one a pain au chocolat. It'd just be common sense. And yeah, I had nothing for that. He's completely right. So that's what he calls it, right? Then it goes out into the display case, and the label on it actually says pain au cacao, cocoa bread. And I think that's the interesting part, actually. Even in Toulouse, where nobody says pain au chocolat, everybody still knows exactly what those three words are pointing at. They mean the flaky one, the chocolatine. So if he writes pain au chocolat on that label, somebody's going to come in expecting the flaky one and walk out holding a little brown baguette. His own reason for changing it was to avoid confusion. So he can be completely right about what the words ought to mean, and yet still has to face the reality that those words are already taken. A few years back, a linguist at the Sorbonne named Mathieu Avanzi slipped a question about all this into an online survey. Nothing dramatic about it, just a list of the words a person might actually use. And you pick yours. Chocolatine, or pain au chocolat, or petit pain, and a few more besides. Avanzi's position is that all this regional variation actually isn't a problem with French. It's one of the good things about it. So back in 2015, he started putting surveys like that up on a blog and asking people to fill them in. More than 10,000 people answered, from France and Belgium and Switzerland, plus another 6,000 or so from the French-speaking part of Eastern Canada. The maps he made out of it got picked up and passed all around the French internet. And eventually, that turned into a book, Atlas du Français de nos régions. And the good bit about the map is this. Each dot on it is pinned to a postal code, and the postal code is where that person spent most of their childhood. So if you grew up in Bordeaux and you've lived in Paris for the last 20 years, you are still a dot down in Bordeaux. Which means the map isn't really showing you where the word gets used. It's showing you where the word got learned. So I guess in a way, we're tracing the origin or roots of the words and terms. The map itself is a nice thing to look at. There's a big southwestern quarter of the country that says chocolatine, and it holds together. It's a solid block. It isn't scattered around. Most of the rest of France says pain au chocolat. Then, along parts of the north and the east, up near Belgium and Germany and Switzerland, people say petit pain or petit pain au chocolat. And in one small pocket of Belgium, coq au chocolat. Nobody fights about those, though, which I think is the funny part. Because nobody in the history of the internet has ever been furious about a coq. There's also a pole, and it's a different kind of instrument, so the two are worth keeping apart. Avanzi's map is people who volunteered. The poll was run by IFOP, which is one of the big French polling firms, and they ran it in 2019. They took about 1,000 French adults, picked so that the sample looks like the country, and they showed them a photograph of the pastry and asked them what they were looking at. Just, what is this? And nationally, 84% of them said pain au chocolat, and 16% said chocolatine. Then you get down to Nouvelle-Aquitaine, which is that southwestern block, Bordeaux and everything around it. And 63% of people there say chocolatine, completely flipped. The map is asking where people grew up. The poll is asking where people are now. Two different questions, so you can't stack them together. They agree on the thing that matters, though, which is that the line is real, and it sits in the same place. Okay, we get it. What about the history and the true origin of these French pastries? Viennoiserie. That's the French word for the whole category. The croissants, the pain au chocolat, the spiral one with the raisins in it. All of that goes under one heading, and it means, roughly, Viennese things. Things from Vienna. That raises the fairly obvious question, and it's one I had myself. Does that mean their origin is actually Vienna? What's the history behind that? And the first story waiting for me was a fantastic story. Really fantastic. 1683. The Ottoman army is laying siege to Vienna, and the bakers of the city are down in their cellars in the middle of the night because the middle of the night is when you make bread. And while they're down there working, they hear something. Digging underneath them. Ottoman sappers tunneling under the city walls. So the bakers raise the alarm, the tunnel gets found, the attack fails, and the city holds. And afterwards, as a reward, the The bakers are given the right to make a pastry shaped like a crescent moon, because the crescent was the shape flying on the Ottoman flags, so that every morning, forever, Vienna gets to eat the enemy for breakfast. I love that story. What a nice little origin story. And I wanted it to be true. But let's hear from the historian. Pierre Leclerc is a food historian at the University of Liège, over in Belgium. And when an interviewer laid all of that out for him, his answer ran to 3 words. Ce sont des légendes. These are legends. Then he goes to the paperwork. There's a Viennese poem from 1227 that already mentions a kipferl, which is the Austrian crescent roll. And it's sitting there in a list of the Christmas things the city's bakers brought to the Duke. 1227. That is 456 years before the siege that supposedly invented it. The pastry is older than the story about where the pastry came from by 4.5 centuries. You can't invent a thing that's already on a Christmas list. And then there's what really settles it. That heroic baker story doesn't appear in any written source anywhere until 1938. And that's where a man called Dr. Alfred Gottschalk comes in. He was working with the chef Prosper Montagnier on a book called the Larousse Gastronomique, which is not just a cookbook. It's the big standard French reference on food, the one everybody else checks. Escoffier himself wrote the preface for it. And in that first edition, in 1938, Gottschalk writes down the story of the bakers and the tunnel. No source, no document, just the story. And once it's in there, with Escoffier's name on the front of the book, it's settled. Every croissant article since references and copies it. Oh, if you didn't know, Auguste Escoffier was a French chef and culinary writer who popularized and updated traditional French cooking methods. He's also referred to as the father of modern cookery, one of the biggest names in French culinary. Jim Chevalier, who has spent a long time on croissant history, points out what should have tipped everybody off years ago. The bagel has a 1683 Vienna siege origin story. So does the Kugelhopf, which is a big ring-shaped Austrian cake. So that is one siege, and it apparently invented 3 separate breakfast pastries. The dates do the same to the Marie Antoinette version of the origin story, the one where she carries croissants from Vienna to Paris. She was Austrian, that's why the story sticks to her. She came to France in 1770 to marry the man who became Louis XVI. But croissants don't turn up in Paris until the middle of the 1800s, which is more than 50 years after she died. So the crescent roll is real, and it's genuinely old, and it's not a croissant. A kipferl is just a crescent-shaped roll. The thing we mean by a croissant, the flaky one, the one you know where the flakes and crumbs get everywhere when you bite into it or tear it, that comes from lamination, which is where the dough gets butter folded through it again and again until it bakes up into hundreds of separate layers. And the lamination is the French part. Somebody still had to carry the Viennese version to Paris, though, and that turns out to be one specific man. August Zang was an Austrian artillery officer. Then, in about 1837, he wasn't. He left the army, moved to Paris, and opened a bakery on the Rue de Richelieu, which, at the time, was roughly the smartest shopping street in a very smart city. He called it the Boulangerie Viennoise, the Viennese bakery. And he sold what you'd sell if you were homesick and Viennese, so pain viennois, which is a soft, enriched white loaf, and kipferl, those little crescent rolls. He also brought a steam oven over from Vienna, which he had a patent on. The way it works is you get damp hay in there, and the hay makes the steam. And the steam does something to the crust while the bread bakes, and the loaves come out with a shine on them that Parisian bakeries just weren't getting. That oven ended up becoming standard across France. And it worked immediately. By 1839, the Paris papers were writing about the new Viennese bakery and its exquisite crisp rolls. Sainte-Beuve, who was about the most important literary critic in France at the time, was telling a friend that they were all going to go and eat cake on Tuesday at a very splendid and very delectable Viennese bakery. And every other baker in the city started copying him. And here comes a little bit of a twist. While all of that is happening, while he has the most talked about bakery in Paris, Zhang isn't really thinking about bread. So what is he doing? He's standing in the middle of a media capital, and he's watching how a man called Émile de Girardin runs a newspaper. And Girardin is worth watching, because a couple of years before that, he'd cut the price of a paper in half, from 80 francs down to 40, and made up the difference by selling advertising instead, which is more or less the invention of the modern newspaper. More or less. So Zhang is in there studying it, and not the writing side of it, but the business side, how the thing gets put together and paid for and out the door every morning. He's waiting, basically, waiting for something to open. And in 1848, it opens, which is that Austria lifts its censorship. So Zhang leaves Paris, goes home to Vienna, and starts a newspaper. Girardin's paper was called La Presse. Zhang called his Die Presse. He didn't just take the business model home with him. He took the name. And it still exists. People were writing before long that he had entirely revolutionized journalism in the Austrian capital. He sold the paper in 1867 and went into banking. And after that, there were estates and mines and eventually a castle. Now, he didn't invent the croissant, and nobody serious says he did. What he did was open the door. He's the reason there was actual Viennese bread coming out of an actual oven in Paris in the 1840s, on the smartest street in the city, in a shop that everybody else was busy copying. Now, Zhang is also where the most repeated explanation for the word chocolatine starts. Jean Lapoujade is a baker in Toulouse and a historian of bread, and he wrote a book called Les mots du pain, The Words of Bread. And his account goes like this. Zhang's Paris shop sold a chocolate version of the crescent, and it had a German name on it, something like Schokoladencroissant. And the Austrian accent does a thing where the D's come out sounding more like T's. So Parisians heard this Austrian word coming across a bakery counter, chewed on it a bit, and what came out the other side was chocolatine. And it's a lovely explanation, it really is. It's the sort of thing that sounds right the moment you hear it. Again, the trouble starts when you go looking for the pastry itself. The actual Austrian chocolate crescent that all of this is supposed to start from. So where is it? Well, nobody has ever produced one. There's no advertisement for it, no menu with it on, no recipe, no dictionary entry, nothing at all anywhere with that word printed on it. There's also Jim Chevalier. Chevalier is the man who wrote the book on Auguste Zhang, and he has gone on the record specifically to say that Zhang did not bring the pain au chocolat over, and did not bring the chocolatine, and did not bring the chocoladencroissant either. Then there's the chronology. The word chocolatine does exist in the 1800s. It turns up in 1853, patented by a man called Eugène Pierre Perron. And it isn't a pastry at all. It's a sweet, something like a dragée, which is the hard sugar-shelled kind you get at weddings, except softer than that. And somebody writing at the time says it's the bonbon of the old man and the small child, which I think means it was soft enough for people who couldn't manage a hard one at either end of life. Sweet for the toothless. After that, the word just keeps getting picked up and put back down again. There's a cake sold as a chocolatine in 1931, And as late as 1976, Gaston Lenôtre, who is about as authoritative as Paris pastry gets, is still using chocolatine in his own kitchen to mean a biscuit base with chocolate mousse on top of it. Not the thing in the paper bag, something else entirely. Meanwhile, in ordinary bakeries across the Southwest, the word has been settling onto the pastry we're talking about since the 1960s. So there are two meanings running at the same time, in two different worlds, and the one that wins is the bakery one, which means the word chocolatine is old. It's been around since the 1850s, and the pastry that answers to it now is young. It only really picks up that name in living memory. And there's about 100 years sitting in between the two of them. And if all of this is making your head spin, that's okay. Mine too. History is not my strong suit. Lapoujade, the historian of bread, knows all of this, by the way. He's not hiding from it. He gets to the end of his own theory and says, "On ne sait pas expliquer pourquoi la chocolatine est restée dans le sud-ouest." We can't explain why chocolatine stayed in the southwest. And every single one of these is somebody wanting the name to have a reason, whether that's the bakers down in the tunnel, or Marie Antoinette, or an Austrian accent doing something to a D. You hear a word and you build a story underneath it so that it makes sense. Kind of like what I did on that riverbank. I read the word snail and I built a whole garlic butter-flavored unique pastry out of thin air. I just got caught faster, because I had to eat mine. Before we close out this episode, let me share one more quick, funny little story. Myriam Gudin grew up in the Hautes-Pyrénées, right down on the Spanish border, which is about as deep into chocolatine country as France gets. And her bakery is nowhere near there. It's in a town called Lorets d'Argenton, up near Thouars, which is way out west and a long way north of where she's from. And it is not chocolatine country at all. She's on the wrong side of the line, literally. She sells chocolatines, only chocolatines. La chocolatine, she says, c'est sacré pour nous. It's sacred for us. When people ask her what a pain au chocolat is, she has an answer ready, and it is a very good answer. A pain au chocolat, she says, is when you take a bread and you cut it open and you put a bar of chocolate inside it. So, both names go up in her shop. And here are the prices. A chocolatine is €1.05. A pain au chocolat is €5. And what happens, apparently, what happens every single time, is that somebody walks in fully committed to buying pain au chocolat. They see the board and change their mind on the spot. She says they change it very fast. They're good sports about it. From what I can tell, not one person has ever actually paid the €5. And some of the customers ask her, straight out, what the actual difference is between a chocolatine and a pain au chocolat. And she tells them, about 300 kilometers. Et voilà, I want a pain au chocolat real bad now. À la prochaine fois.